Hello, this is a summary of what happens in Act 1 of the Duchess of Malfi, or rather the tragical history of the Duchess of Malfi. Remember that it's a tragedy. The title is creating irony from the beginning. Tis the tragical history of the Duchess of Malfi. So people go into the play will know that it will end as a tragedy, and so everything is foreshadowed from the beginning. The audience know what's going to happen, and therefore their expectations are reinforced through imagery of blood and the conventions of tragedy that they would be very familiar with. Once again, another play set in Italy. Many of Shakespeare's plays are set in Italy because it's the home of the Renaissance, full of wealth and intrigue and corruption, and it allowed English playwrights to comment on their own courts without fear of treasonous accusations. So when we talk about the corruption of the Italian court, it can also be implied it's the corruption of the court of King James. Okay, so to the English audience, the play reinforces prejudices of Catholic Italy and a place of corruption. Ferdinand is surrounded by sycophants who he encourages to laugh when he laughs. And what we see is that the highest in society are seen as moral corruption. The cardinal, who's second to the Pope, is seen as corrupt, and we'll talk about how each individual character is highlighted as corrupt from the beginning. John Webster senses corruption as the main theme of the play from the very beginning of the play. We start with the cardinal, we learn about his intrigue with Bosola, and we then go on to see the corruption of Ferdinand, and we take each of these in turn. The scene between Antonio and his good friend Delio is kind of like a Greek chorus. They comment on the characters as they come onto the scene. So the imagery of a well, a fountain, that if it's poisoned, then spreads poison throughout the court, is a typical imagery that we might find in the tragedy. So the cardinal, who is supposed to be the second holiest man in Italy and could have potentially been Pope if he wasn't so obvious in his bribes, is seen as the most corrupt in all of the play, really, because he is cloaked in the garb of the Catholic Church. But we find that he's employed Bosola possibly to commit murder, and on top of that, he's not even willing to pay Bosola for the sins that he's done. So immediately we see that the cardinal is a worse villain than Bosola, who in himself is a murderer. Now Bosola is a malcontent. He's called the court gall. The gallbladder is the place where bile is stored, and so he's seen as a cynic, a malcontent. These are all words that you could employ in any essay. He's the Machiavellian character, who is the antagonist, who, because he has no place in the play, he's not of high birth or high status, he's going to make his way in the world, and we'll talk about that a little later. Now, he believes he hasn't been recompensed for the deeds he's done for the cardinal, and Antonio and Delio comment on how this ill feeling will fester in Bosola if he's left unrewarded. You might notice a lot of the imagery in the play is to do with disease and about disease spreading, and in a way that fits in with what tragedies are. They're all about revenge, and revenge is seen as a corrosive disease. Those who employ revenge usually are diseased and become diseased by their desire for revenge. So what else do we learn about the cardinal? First of all, that he embodies, perhaps, he's like a medieval personification of sin. So he's bound up in the garb of a cardinal, so his appearance is in complete contradiction to his character. He's committed adultery. He's had sex with Julia, who is the wife of Castruccio. His name implies that he's not sexually active. And so you could comment on the symbolism of names, and you could comment on adultery in comparison with the Merchant's Tale. He reinforced the stereotypes of Catholics as corrupt. Remember, this play would have been performed indoors in Blackfriars to a largely Protestant audience who would have been very much prejudiced against Catholics. So he kind of reinforces those prejudices. Even Bosola criticises him as he would perhaps overmatch the devil. It's not quite the quote, but there's a quote close enough to that. His hypocrisy is foregrounded, and in that he focuses on his sister's reputation and the hypocrisy of women. But perhaps that is undermined by his own hypocrisy and pride. On the subject of pride, we have Ferdinand again. Pride comes before a fall. Pride is one of the chief sins in tragedies, and you should always be aware of it. And this is foregrounded perhaps with Ferdinand, even more so than his brother. He employs Bosola to spy on his sister. He's surrounded by sycophants. He asks them to take fire when I give fire, to laugh when I laugh. Again, this reminds us perhaps of January and Placebo. Language may reveal incestuous impulses. He's fixated on her sexuality. Look at all the times he imagines his sister with her lover. Again, it reminds us of the quote that Antonio or Delio says, I think it's Delio says about Ferdinand. He says he has a most perverse and turbulent nature. And that really sums him up. He is both perverse, particularly in his obsession with his sister, and he has a very turbulent nature. And you should consider how his personality becomes more turbulent as each act goes on. And he particularly seems to, Antonio says this, a most perverse and turbulent nature. His nature becomes more turbulent as each act goes on, and he particularly uses the language of disease. And in a way, the metaphors of disease that he uses foregrounds his own growing madness. Okay. In describing both the Cardinal and Ferdinand, Antonio then goes on to describe the Duchess, and it's pretty clear that he's absolutely in love with her. He says that she practices virtue in everything that she does. Yet there's a sense that this love is doomed. Again, the audience know it. As soon as love shows itself in a tragedy, we know that that love is doomed. Antonio, it should be said, his nobility has been foregrounded both by Bosola and also by Ferdinand. He's seen as heroic, a soldier, virtuous. He talks about how Italy is unlike France in its sense of corruption, and so immediately he's foregrounded as the good character as well. That should be clear. What should also be clear is that in this play there's the complete paradox that even the good characters in an insane world, the sane man must appear insane. In a world that's run by corruption, even the good characters, in order to sort of pursue their lives in a good way, have to deceive. And so he's forced into deception by agreeing to marry out of his social circle. But he's not unaware of the dangers. Antonio says that the ambition that Bosola has to rise up through the ranks, to improve his lot, is a dangerous thing. And when Antonio is offered the chance to marry, he's very aware of the dangers that go with that, and the dangers of ambition. And he says on page 30, I'm just trying to find it, there is a saucy and ambitious devil is dancing in this circle. So he sees ambition as almost like a devil. Ambition, madam, is a great man's madness that is not kept in chains and close pent rooms, but in fair lights and lodgings. So he sees ambition as a dangerous thing. He compares it to a fool that being cold would thrust his hand in the fire. He's kind of aware of the trouble ahead, and as a result, the audience are too. So while we see Antonio as an impressive man, he's impressed in performances of jousts and trials and, you know, in his manner. He's seen as a new prince, a coming man by Ferdinand. While he's impressed us, we see that he's also impressed the Duchess as well. And she invites her maid Cariola to invite him to her bedchamber. I might just say something about Cariola and servants. Unlike Damien in The Merchant's Tale, Cariola stays true to her mistress all the way through. And the Duchess confides in her and tells her the truth. She tells her the truth all the time when she's unable to tell others the truth. Okay, so in Act 1, I'm going to say a couple of things about Bosola. Again, there's another paradox with Bosola, perhaps the most Machiavellian of characters. He stands outside of the fixed world order here. He's a personification of the Renaissance world. He's a man who's out to just for himself, and he's going to work his medicine on others. A Machiavellian has to, by their nature, understand human nature. They know themselves, whereas other characters have no knowledge of themselves, such as Ferdinand. And they're able to play on this knowledge of people's human nature, and so they're able to spy, to lie, to deceive and manipulate. Ferdinand calls him a worthy fellow. Well, obviously the audience know that that's ironic. He's a malcontent. But the interesting thing about Bosola is that because he does know himself and he does know human nature, he often says the most truthful things in the play. So you should really get together a collection of quotes about what he says about human nature and what he says about himself. He's often disgusted with himself, but it doesn't stop him doing disgusting things. And so you should look at how he's both impressed by the Duchess, but he's still willing to deceive her and do the work of her brother. And all the time he's commenting on the hypocrisy of human nature, while also being hypocritical in his own actions. So he's at once both the most distrustful and trustful character in the play, and so he's worthy of study and having some quotes on him. Okay, so the Duchess is talked about first of all by Antonio, and her virtue is seen as the first thing, and her virtue is often described in the play in very religious terms. So she's very much the angel to the way that women are portrayed as whores by the Cardinal and Ferdinand, and Antonio paints her in very religious ways. However, she's still forced to deceive, and I'll look at that a little bit later. She's a contrast and a foil to her brothers. However, she still shares the pride of them in that she does something, and I think kind of willingly knowing the dangers of what she's doing, and there's a kind of pride and defiance that you should be looking for quotes in that, in terms of how she stands up for herself. I'll look at that a little bit later with quotes from Act 1. She's willing to defy society's norms, but she's also willing to confide that she understands the dangers of doing so. You might want to consider how she might be seen as perhaps more reckless by certain elements of the Jacobean audience. But equally, that a Jacobean audience wouldn't necessarily respond to her in one uniform way, any more than we would today. People would see her as in a sympathetic light, in the same way that they saw that woman, I just can't remember her name, but your teachers will have told you about her to research her. The woman at the time who was forced, she was unable to marry because the king said she couldn't marry, and I can't remember her name. Isabella, no, it's gone. You'll find, you'll know it anyway. Don't think they're Jacobean audiences because they're Jacobeans would respond in the same way. Some will see her as reckless and not taking account of her reputation, and some will have sympathy for her. That name will come back to me. The audience might have sympathy for her in the same way as they might have had for Arabella Stuart, the famous aristocrat and also cousin of the king at the time, who was unable to marry the person she loved. And this story about unable to marry the person you love has kind of gone through and is still with us today, presently, I suppose, with the current king who wasn't able to marry the woman he loved. Perhaps Princess Anne as well, perhaps Princess Margaret. There's always kind of restrictions on nobility that I'll talk about a little bit later. Right, so status and class come into this. The Duchess is an aristocrat, and her money wants to be preserved in the family. The brothers want her to preserve her money and status. They want her to remain a widow. That way they can more easily control her. But she's not willing to do that. She's willing to defy. She already has a son and heir from her first marriage. This marriage will be viewed as stemming from lust by her brother, because marriage was seen as only a means for procreation. So you might talk about how this is the comments on this marriage being a marriage of lust can also relate to that of January's. She's defiant also in that she leads. If you look at it, she puts the ring on Antonio's finger. She leads the way. She brings him to her bedchamber. If anything, he's more wary of the dangers, but she leads. She's the one driving the marriage forward. So Ferdinand has Bosola spy on the Duchess and appoints him master of the horses in order to do so. Bosola is reluctant to do so. He sees it as a menial task, but he's willing to do it in order to get advancement. So he's kind of amoral in this act, really. Now, they have different reasons for wanting the Duchess to remain chaste. The cardinal is concerned with social status and reputation. Ferdinand's reasons are much more driven by a sort of psychosexual jealousy, envy, and again, the perverse and turbulent nature comes through in some of the imagery that he uses, and in the way that he sees women as also kind of poisonous and poisoned by their own lust. It kind of reflects his own perverse nature a little bit more. I've said that quite a few times now. As we expect in Act 1, there's always the note of the fear of tragedy to come, and Cariola perhaps sounds a note of caution to her mistress as well as Antonio, voicing his fears. You remember that this is all done undercover, so even the virtuous characters by the end of Act 1 are forced into deception. And I'll talk a little bit about some of these key quotes a little bit later. So it brings us to the end of the first of the act. We have a disorder, a complication. Two brothers do not want their sister to marry. And that leads to two very distinct sides. The good people, Antonio, Cariola, and the Duchess have been marked out in opposition to obviously the very duplicitous evil characters. And that marks the way for the development of rivalry in Act 2. It might be worth considering how women are presented in the beginning of this play, first of all, because I suppose we've spent half the term looking at how women are presented in The Merchant's Tale. They overmatch the devil, their wives who are duplicitous and trick their husbands. They're uncontrollable, they're described as animals, they are defined by their perceived lust and uncontrolled senses, and that unless they're very, very young, there's an inability to control them. And I suppose it's worth considering how women are presented in this play as well. And so you should be matching up some of your quotes with both texts now. So women are seen as objects of desire. They're judged on their appearance. Not only is the Duchess seen as perfection, both in her virtue, but also in her looks as well. Women are seen as objects of sexual desire. The cardinal takes Julia, but doesn't seem to show any love for her. Maybe she's an object of repressed desire for Ferdinand. But Ferdinand also talks in general, as does the cardinal, about women being inconstant, that they change their mind, they cannot be trusted. There's lots of references to animals as well. Bosola in Act 2 just takes out his misogyny on an old lady, presumably because she's old, and he talks insultingly about her appearance and how her diseased appearance perhaps reflects an inner disease. But perhaps this also reflects Bosola's inner disease as well. His misogyny, but also his hatred of mankind in general. So men, on the whole, seem to view women as deceptive and governed by their desires. And we see that from quotes from Bosola, the Cardinal, Ferdinand, even Delio as well, who thinks that, he tries to buy Julia off for sexual purposes. And indeed, Webster does show them as deceiving. The Duchess does lie. Julia is an adulterer. So there's, that can be compared perhaps to how the merchant sort of makes an encomium about marriage, but at the same time in praising wives is also showing how they do deceive as well. However, the difference is that Webster does show women in a sympathetic light. We have to consider that the play is called The Duchess of Malfi. Okay, it's one of two plays that Webster has written in which the protagonist, the tragic heroine, is a woman. The Duchess of Malfi and the White Devil. The lead character in the White Devil, Vittoria, is also seen in a sympathetic light. Women are seen as loyal to each other. Cariola, the servant, is loyal to the end to the Duchess. Julia, in this play, even though she's used almost as a prostitute by the cardinal, and she's an adulterer, she's married, she does have integrity. She cannot be bought. Women are seen as trapped and at the mercy of men. And the Duchess does impress. She is the tragic hero, and so we find very positive virtues in her. She is defiant of her social structures, and she's defiant of her potential imprisonment by her brothers. So let's consider how the Duchess in Act 1 conforms to aspects of a tragic hero. She's of noble birth. I am the Duchess of Malfi. She is not entirely to blame for what happens to her. She's forced to deceive. I will not marry. We are forced to leave the path of true virtue. Women are forced to hide their passions, she says, because it's not acceptable in a society. So in a way, she's a victim of the society in which she's born. She's seen as having very good qualities. Her days are practiced in noble virtue. But she's also aware of the thing that she's doing. I will essay this dangerous venture, she says to Cariola. I winked and chose a husband. She's aware that she's given up her reputation, perhaps. More than my life, I've given up my fame. And she's trusting in Cariola. So she is aware of the dangers that she's doing. So you could say that her fatal flaw perhaps is her pride, defiance, and weakness. Maybe these are her defiance and pride, and recklessness, I should say, are maybe her flaws. So she is defiant. She said, diamonds are of most value that pass through jewelers' hands. She's not going to accept the criticisms of women. And you should maybe make quotes on where she makes a robust defense of women, rather like May does and Proserpina do in The Merchant's Tale. It would be interesting to compare the defense of women's speeches that these characters make. But we finish Act 1 with sort of a degree of sympathy for the Duchess. She cannot escape her position. The misery of us that are born great, we are forced to woo, as none dare woo us. She has no, it's not her fault that she's been born the Duchess of Malfi. This is not in her power to change. So she's a victim of her own status. But ultimately she ends the act and where it's easy to sympathise with her. This is flesh and blood, sir. 'Tis not a figure cut in alabaster. She's not made of plaster. She's merely a woman. A woman asking a man to love her. I think that might be from some kind of sick, is that from Notting Hill? I'm just a girl asking a man to love her, something like that. So again, it plays on the audience's sympathies. She's not just the Duchess of Malfi. She's ultimately a woman looking to marry the man she loves. And so that sets up the tragedy for what happens next. So we consider the playwright's intentions. He's highlighted Catholic countries and the Catholic Church as hypocritical. He's ridiculing the actions of Ferdinand and the Cardinal. But perhaps there's also some ridicule for the English court of King James, surrounding himself with sycophants. Maybe there can be an indirect criticism of the court themselves, who would be the people coming to see this play. So it's a tricky thing to see that this play can be wrapped up in deception itself. It could be attacking the very people who have come to see this play in the sense of their own pride and hypocrisy. Perhaps the playwright's intentions, as he's done 2 plays of the same nature, is to promote the cause of strong women, defiant of their age, trying to live their lives as they wish. But other people will see this as recklessness, which is indicative of a Renaissance world which is falling apart. Maybe he's attacking a patriarchal society. Maybe this play also reinforces misogynistic desires about how men view women. There are contradictory views of how women are really seen in this play, and you should be aware of how there's no one way of seeing the character of the Duchess. She can be seen as both reckless and heroic at the same time. Whereas I think the villains are much more stock characters. The Cardinal is, in his nature, there's no redeeming features that we see in him. Although some people at the time might see him in his urge to keep her a widow as reinforcing patriarchal norms. Maybe this play celebrates the strength of women and shows them that they have the potential to be at the centre of tragedy, something that Shakespeare hasn't really done up himself. There endeth the lecture. Thank you.